Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, April the 22nd, and welcome to our video commentary. Today we're going to remember President Nixon, who died on this day, April 22nd, 1994. Richard Nixon was really one of the most consequential politicians of the 20th century, a man who was on the ballot three times for president and twice as vice president with Dwight Eisenhower. In fact, from 1952 to 1974, the name Richard Nixon was on the ballot in 52, 56 as the vice president with Dwight Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, and then in 1960, when he was Republican nominee, he lost to John Kennedy, and then of course in 1968 and 1972, when he was elected and reelected on his own. Very consequential man. He was born in California in 1913. Like many other young men, he went to the war, came back, was elected to the House in 1946. I think around that time, he met a wonderful young woman that we all came to love as our First Lady, Pat Nixon. They had two daughters. He was elected, as I said, to Congress in 46, eventually to the U.S. Senate in 1950. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower selected him as his partner on the Republican ticket that year that went on to sweep the country. He was reelected in 1956. And then, as I said, he lost to John Kennedy in 1960. After losing to John Kennedy, a lot of people thought he was finished, particularly when he lost once again for the governorship of California when he was defeated there. And most people thought that was the end of Richard Nixon, including probably Nixon himself. But he made a tremendous comeback. And in 1968, he won the nomination, was elected in a very close election against Hubert Humphrey, and then he went on to be reelected in 1972. Huge reelection, something like 49 states and 61% of the popular vote against Senator McGovern. Much of his first term was dedicated to the war in Vietnam. He also was the first president to go to China. But Nixon is also remembered for some things that we may not associate with a Republican president, like, for example, affirmative action, the EPA, OSHA. All of those things were actually created in President Nixon's first and second term. So in many ways, he was probably a lot more liberal than I think most Republicans would realize, but that's who he was on the domestic front. Then came Watergate, which he obviously himself admitted was a terrible mistake. He resigned the presidency and went into isolation. And we didn't hear much from Nixon really for about 4 or 5 years. He wrote a wonderful memoir called RN. It's a 2-volume memoir, a great book. I read it when it came out in the 70s, and I thought it was a fantastic book. But in the 1980s, Richard Nixon came back. He didn't come back politically, but he came back in many ways as a senior statesman and started writing some amazing books about foreign policy. It was a tremendous influence to every single president, certainly Reagan, to Gerald Ford, to the first Bush, even to Bill Clinton, who developed a close relationship with President Nixon. And he was a tremendous consultant to presidents because of his knowledge of foreign policy, particularly the Soviet Union. So we remembered Richard Nixon today. You know, you have to look at the man, of course. You have to be honest and remember Watergate. That was obviously a big part of his presidency. But as time passes, he has now been gone for 24 years. He left the presidency over 40 years ago. As time passes, I think Richard Nixon is starting to get a complete look. And it's interesting to me in some of these rankings now that are coming out, he's really inching up, not into a great president category, but he's certainly not at the other end where he was, at least initially, when he left the presidency. So he'll never be a great president because of Watergate, but I think as time passes, people will get a better sense of who he was and will give him credit for many of the things that he did. So Richard Nixon, who died on this day in 1994, the 37th President of the United States. Have a great day, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. We have all of these videos over at YouTube. We have them on my blog, and we also have them on Twitter. Bye-bye, everybody.